Welcome, welcome, welcome everybody to Tipping Points, where we ask the questions that matter about how we balance conservation and development. Like I said, for all those who've joined, I am Noxolo Ntshaba, and I have the pleasure of being today's facilitator for the 14th OGRC Tipping Points webinar. Our focus today is to listen to youth voices and their ideas on environmental matters and priorities for our African continent. So I'm very, very excited to be here. This is a topic that I'm passionate about and look forward to a productive and insightful discussion. Please be aware that the session is recorded and will be available on the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation channel. And as mentioned, feel free to introduce yourselves, engage in the chat box, and don't hesitate to ask any questions throughout the webinar. Just a brief background on myself. I am Noxolo Ntshaba, and I head up the communications for Oppenheimer Generations. I'm a marketing and communications professional. I'm passionate about connecting people, organizations, and brands, and particularly giving platforms to youth. So like I said, this is a very, very exciting topic for me. And just in terms of the webinar, I will follow a formatted structure. We'll begin with 3 panelists, very esteemed panelists, and each will give some input on the topic at hand, and then we'll move out to open the floor for discussion to you audiences who have joined us. And like we said, we encourage you to keep asking questions in the chat box function, and we'll circle back at the end of the webinar where we can then do our Q&As. Also, please be sure to make sure that you keep updated with the OGRC's newsletter as well as their social media platforms. We'll also share that with you in the chat box after the session. And today, I am pleased to introduce our panel of young environmentalists. We have Karabo Mukena, Reynold Mangudu, and Rio Button. So Karabo is a natural scientist who recently completed her master's degree in animal, plant, and environmental science with a distinction at the University of Witwatersrand, specializing in psychology, a new terminology that I just learned. Reynold Mangudu is a 27-year-old poet, writer, gamer, environmental activist from Namibia, who just completed his master's in philosophy at the University of Stellenbosch. Then we have Rio, who is a conservation biologist, with a knack for science communication, map working, and empowering science-based conservation. She is very curious and quite in awe of wild spaces. In fact, earlier this year, she documented Somaliland's first marine protected area as a commercial diver and camera assistant. So like I said, we have a very, very esteemed panel of young environmentalists, and I'm very much looking for this discussion. So I will now hand over to our panelists, who will give a brief background on themselves, and then maybe discuss more about what they're passionate about and share their ideas and priorities for the environmental matters for the African continent. So I'm going to ask if Rio Button can maybe share first, then we'll hand over to you, Reynold Mangudu, and then Karabo, you can also just then wrap it up in terms of introducing yourselves. So take it away, Rio.
Hey. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor, especially to be here with you, Nox, and Reynold and Karabo. I'm really excited. I have a range of experience in conservation and working with the youth that spans from sort of before my professional career started. I've just begun my PhD in marine spatial planning here in Brisbane. But before that, I trained students to do research diving in Mozambique, taught interns to use data collection apps that I'd made on Robben Island. And while I was studying, worked as a demonstrator, playing the role of unofficial mentor to many. While studying, I also volunteered helping kids from disadvantaged communities learn to snorkel and surf and teaching them a little bit about marine conservation in a fun environment. What's really important to me, especially working with young people, is celebrating the small stuff that maintains enthusiasm and the momentum of a movement or project. So like, what did the moon landing and South Africa's marine protected areas increasing tenfold in 2019 have in common? Well, they're all huge achievements that came from the accumulation of tiny, tiny steps, incremental changes, all adding up to reach a tipping point and bring about a genuine, meaningful change or something big. The moon landing took 8 years, 10 practice runs, more than 400,000 engineers, scientists, and technicians to make those first tentative steps on another planetary body. Much like South Africa's marine protected area expansion, the design for our marine protected area network took 12 years of research, spatial planning, and an immense number of scientists, technicians, and science students from a range of groups, organizations, and departments. It's actually just too many for me to list now, but it was really a collaborative effort. It wasn't something that just happened overnight. These huge, huge jumps forward, these huge achievements came from the accumulation of really small achievements. And maybe I believe in the power of incremental change and celebrating each and every step, because I know how incremental my own contributions to conservation have been. The problems at hand that we face can seem so big and overwhelming. It seems so unattainable to make any kind of meaningful change sometimes. But we have to keep up the energy and make the small changes that cumulatively can bring about big changes. Things like climate change really can be daunting and overwhelming. And often social media presents us with, and headlines present us with these silver bullet solutions, simple, quick fixes to complex problems. And I love those stories. They're dramatic and they hold your attention, but nothing actually really happens overnight. And it's so interesting to get the full story of why change happens and see all those small steps, rather than the sort of problem sudden perfect solution presented. So yeah, I really want to focus on celebrating the small achievements that contribute to long-term solutions and change. And this is really what I think the youth need to remember. They must not be disheartened because the climate crisis is huge and overwhelming. We mustn't be paralyzed into not doing anything at all because we didn't magically wake up with the perfect solution. Instead, we need to provide spaces to nurture youth-initiated and driven environmental projects. Thanks.
Thank you, Rio. I'll hand over to you now, Reynolds.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Reynolds Mangundu, and I'm an African from Namibia. I'm really privileged to be here today in this space with these profound speakers because it's always aspiring and inspiring to be in a space where young people can speak about how best to shape our future. And of course, for me, sustainability is really being present, whether it's in the digital realm or the physical realm, because young people are then able to co-create and to navigate alternatives about our common future. I was born in a very small village in north central Namibia, where narratives taught by my father spoke about the beautiful forests that used to exist, the wildlife that used to be close to home, and the rivers that used to meander at their own pace. But unfortunately, when I grew up, I could see none of this. And I could only imagine through these narratives and stories told by my father around the bonfire, where we all lamb together as a place to connect and to reflect on the day. And I think for me, that was in that lens that I really dedicated my life and professional career to support sustainability transitions in Namibia and Africa at large, where I believe that the future of us depends on the regeneration of Africa. But for Africa to regenerate, we really need to look at alternative paradigms beyond our obsession for growth and beyond the paradigms of extraction and destruction. And it's that lens that I really took up this multifaceted approach, working under various organizations in Namibia to bring about change. I'm the current chairperson of the Namibian Environment and Wildlife Society. And of course, currently I'm at the Sustainability, Innovation and Research Congress in Port Elizabeth, where many young Africans as well as policymakers are gathered in a space to think deeply about the future of Africa and what that could potentially mean. But of course, I work with many communities in southern Namibia, where we are looking at connecting conservation and community, because conservation really doesn't make sense without the community. And currently I'm working with a community called Maltair, where we are really trying to build what we call a well-being economy, a local economy that is rooted, where we are building an infrastructure of opportunities for communities connecting the food, water, and energy nexus. And of course, you know, when the enemy strikes, I'm always forced to put on my activist hat. For the last 2 years, I've been working with communities in the Kavango, where Recon Africa, a Canadian oil and gas exploration company, has been exploring for oil in one of our most sensitive areas. And to date, we've managed to mobilize local and international voices. We've run and wrote journals with Prince Harry, Leonardo DiCaprio. And finally, after 2 years, we can see that a lot has been done. And our hope is that we can get our government to really rethink, you know, about what we mean about progress. And I'm very fortunate to be here today, because I believe all of us present here today are guardians of Earth's grace and delicate, and we are gathered in a compassionate space where we are all have hearts alight, like the stars in the night, and illuminating a path where we can all see our future as bright. So I look forward to our deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reynold. I could see the poet coming out in you. We love that bit of poetry. Well done. Thank you. Thank you. So now we'll hand over to Karabo.
Good morning, Nox. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Reynold is definitely a hard show to follow. The poet in you came out in that.
Yeah, I was thinking you also going to rap.
Yeah. Good afternoon, actually. My name is Karabo Mokoena, and as Nox has introduced me, I am a recent graduate at Wits University, who specialized in phycology, which is literally the study of microalgae. Also in the process of starting a PhD in the same field, but more towards water sustainability and algal bloom formation. I'm passionate about water. I'm a big advocate for water sustainability in South Africa. Currently in South Africa, we are looking towards a 70% water deficit by 2030. And I do believe that there's a lot of room for us as youth to come in and take action towards having plans for that and rectifying the water challenges that we currently have. I'm also a member of 2 organizations. I'm the chairperson of of the Local Youth Development Forum, which is a youth forum that we started, and I'm in charge of the Water Working Committee. And our focus is on capacitating and skills development within the water sector in the local government level, looking at what gaps are there, what gaps can we fill, and sort of encourage more youth to take on jobs within the water sector, but also those that are unemployed to find ways to innovate in the sector and create employment as well. I'm also part of the South Africa Youth Parliament for Water. With the Parliament, we created a water action plan that is to address the water issues in South Africa, and I was also part of the delegation at the UN Water Conference. In my spare time, I am an entrepreneur as well. I'm very passionate about educating youth in thinking for themselves and innovating and not relying on job opportunities. We do have a very high unemployment rate, so that's where my passions lie, and that's where I've been. And thank you so much for this opportunity. It's great to see youth voices given a voice to discuss what we can do. Many times we forget that youth are young professionals, so we should also be allowed to take seats in the big tables and just take part in policy making and decision making. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, all three of you. And I couldn't agree more that, it is really about having the seat at the table and getting the tools to build new tables and innovate. And like I said, this is very much a passion point of mine in terms of providing youth with these platforms. And I think we can all agree here that this is a very, very well accomplished and esteemed panel. And if I can just say, I'm highly impressed at how much you've achieved so early on in the working professional world. So maybe, Karabo, let me swing it back to you and just ask, you mentioned finding solutions and plans for the water deficit, but yeah, I just wanted to see, can you come up with one example of how youth and projects and young people make a difference or an impact?
Yes, Nox, thank you for that. Currently, I am part of the organization, the South Africa Youth Parliament for Water. It is part of a bigger organization called the Water Youth Parliament for Water. And what they do is they advocate for of young people in decision-making in the water sector at all levels. It's in over 80 countries in the world, but we've recently started a South Africa chapter. And the focus was the chapter was to have one, because we didn't have one in South Africa, but our mission is to mobilize SDG 6 in all sustainable, inclusive, and participatory manners. So what we've done is we have created a water action plan, which is a call of action that is to be sent to the higher ups within governance and all the people involved in water and sanitation in South Africa. And it is a collaborative effort from within South Africa's water sector. And it's just a joint message or statement that will be delivered to sort of make the government aware that we do have ways in which we can help you in addressing the issues that we have in South Africa in the water sector. We also did a video campaign that we presented at the UN Water Conference. And the video campaign was discussing the different water issues that we have are faced with too much water, which is something we saw in KZN with the flooding. At the same time, we also have a drought or too little water in PE, which is approaching net zero. And then we also have polluted water in the Gauteng area, especially in Pretoria, where we have man-made pollution in natural water bodies. So the idea was the video was to play it at the side events and to highlight the issues that are happening in South Africa and to sort of say this is a call of action that can be done and how youth can be involved in helping that happen. We are also doing a lot in terms of outreach, raising awareness. We are doing a lot of community outreach projects with our partner organization, World Merit South Africa, which targets all the SDGs instead of just focusing on the water SDG. So there's a lot of collaborations within the youth organizations where we are trying to address SDGs and get towards the SDG goals in 2030. But of course, we will be needing a lot of support from other structures and all of that. Yes, thank you.
Wonderful, and thank you again, Karabo. I love how you are so hands-on in terms of providing that example, and you really are on the ground to help the future of Africa. And maybe just to table off that, Reynold, what would you say are some of the obstacles in achieving this type of impact as a young person?
Thank you so much for the question. And I'm speaking in the context of Namibia, and especially when it comes to the representation of young people in decision-making processes. And when you look at policy, is that, for instance, in Namibia, there is very little youth representation in the overall political structure and decision-making process, so which makes it a little bit difficult to push policy and to mobilize for resources for implementation. And of course, in terms of initiatives or sort of plans that are geared towards rethinking our use of resources, there's often lack of political will. And especially, I always say our African politicians, especially those from Namibia, they suffer from a syndrome of economic growth. And because we have such a big focus on resource extraction and obstruction for growth, so this really affects them, in the way they take young people seriously. And using myself an example, for instance, a lot of young people have been mobilizing for the last 2 years to speak against extractive companies, exploring for oil and gas in our most sensitive areas. But of course, we have been labeled as, climate hooligans and as anti-activists, anti-development activists. And of course, limited financial resources. We tend to see that in terms of resource allocation in our government structures, they are often what they call priority areas. And very much often these priority areas are very linked to resource extraction. And so when you speak about mobilizing resources to get communities educated about their water rights, or to get effective water management practices in place, government is often very, reluctant. And lastly, perhaps, is also institutional barriers. Of course, existing institutions, they come with a lot of bureaucracies, that might not be supportive or receptive to the youth parliament's proposal, for instance. And of course, resistance from this, can create obstacles for the implementation of these beautiful plans. And then lack of education and awareness. Many young people are not fully aware about the power that we hold, as young people, as a potent force for change. And unless we really educate them, then, very few young people will be involved in this process. And I think the key is to really educate other young people to come on board, and as Karabo and many of other young people from South Africa has done.
Yeah, and I have to agree there, Reynold. I think it's the recognition of, yes, there are these obstacles, but educating more and more young people, and the awareness of we have agency and the power to actually implement change, if we are to see a better future. So Rio, maybe let me go to you now. We have learned that trying to take action without involving people affected on the ground does not work or lead to any change. How do you take on that task as a young person?
100%. We've learned that we really need to include people and not just pay lip sync to it, to really meaningfully include people. And one of the things that I think is key is actually what you refer to yourself as doing today, and you totally are, is facilitating. Facilitating as opposed to teaching or lecturing, really, really listening and following the interests of the people involved, and then helping, guiding them and supporting them in their initiatives and their ideas. And I've been really privileged to see some great examples of facilitation with the youth and empowerment through roving reporters, WES's Young Reporters for the Environment, and then also the Responsible Fisheries Alliance. The Responsible Fisheries Alliance was really fantastic. They put us in a room, scientists, fishermen, fisheries monitors. They gave us some prompts and activities, and we learned so much from each other. Information flowed in all directions. Fishermen could share what was really happening at sea and opened up about how regulations can be cheated. Scientists could share things and answer questions like, why do we need sharks? Why are they important for our ecosystems? And then the monitors had the opportunities to show the unique challenges that they face. And just having this platform to discuss this ecosystem approach to fishery in a safe space, I really believe creating spaces like this is so important to facilitating finding solutions. I can elaborate on the other two if there's time at the end, but roving reporters and WES's Young Reporters for the Environment, another two great examples of really taking what the youth find important and supporting them in telling their own stories the way they see it, and really getting that out there to a national platform, at least in the case of roving reporters.
Yeah, and I guess what you're trying to say, or what I'm hearing, is it's really being on the ground and having that immersive experience to understand what communities need. So thank you so much again. And just to all three of you, thank you for just sharing your ideas and a bit of the background on the environmental matters for Africa. And I loved throughout each piece how, again, it's future focused, it's solutions focused, to shape a better South Africa, a better Africa, and a better continent. So now I would love us to get into the discussion and invite the audience in. We did have a few questions on the Eventbrite that people have submitted. So I'll table those onto our panelists and then open up the floor to anyone here who wants to have questions. I see that we've got one or two in the chat as is. So maybe, Reynold, let's start with you. As the youth of Africa, how can we make sure that in our daily lives we influence others to live a sustainable life? As Africa is dealing with a myriad of issues, and sustainability and conservation seems to be less of a priority and thus taking somewhat of a backseat.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the thought-provoking question. I think very much for me that what stands out is the fact that we need to lead by example. We need those stewards that inspire other young people. But of course, we need to take them along in our experiences when we work with communities, when we work in the sustainability discourse or in conservation, for instance. And just to give a typical example, in 2017, I co-founded a platform called Games for the SDGs. And this was a platform that brings young people in a space together to co-create and to navigate. So what the games do is, through role playing, through board games, exposes young people to real life challenges. And for me, what's particularly interesting is the fact that there's always a space to reflect on the experiences in the game. And through that reflection, young people undergo a mental mode shift that leads to behavioral change, because they are able to reflect on experiences in the game. And those are like real-time experiences that they experience in their communities. And through that process of reflection, they are really able to be sensitized and to be empowered to work towards change in their communities.
Thank you, Ronald. I guess, again, it boils back down to education, awareness, and the reflection, the daily reflections within the various communities. So thank you, Ronald. We had another question that we'll table to Karabo. How do we balance national development and economic growth without negatively impacting marginalized communities? And I feel this is very much in your area.
Thank you for that question. I think we also have to consider that sustainable development and economic development can happen together with the marginalized communities. We're seeing a lot of sustainable development or technologies and methodologies being adopted from first world countries. Most of our research is based on what the other countries are doing, and we need to do a shift into looking at what are those communities doing already to survive and building on that. A mistake that we're constantly making in industry and in research is we're not including the communities themselves in the process. So the way for us to understand those people and to find, I would say, solutions for them is to include them in the process. So for example, if we look at some people in rural communities where they don't have access to a lot of land or to water, they are currently farming vegetables and tires, right? That's an innovation that they have adapted for themselves to survive in that area. Yeah. They've also adapted a way to keep moisture in those plants in the tires by just covering them up with peels. So there's innovation in marginalized communities. And what we need to do is go into those communities, see what they're doing, and try to scale it up or understand it so that we can help them survive as well. So sustainable development to me personally is not just about what's out there, but it's about let's look at what we can do within our communities, within our spaces to have a better environment. Another thing that you can also do is for economic growth is we need to change the narrative from go to university, get a job, start a job, and change it to educate yourself, be innovative, and start a business so you can create employment. As I said earlier, employment is a big problem in South Africa, especially amongst the youth. But we need to change the narrative to the youth actually creating the jobs, especially in green economies. Yes.
And I love what you say there again. It's about the innovation, but empowering the communities. It's about looking at what are the means that we have, understanding the community, and particularly with marginalized groups. I mean, the community probably knows more in your space about, water, and it's just giving that platform for them to then innovate in those spaces. So yeah, so thank you so much again, Garabo. So let's, we had another question, and I'll pose this one to you, Rio. And it was how do you think experienced conservationists can contribute towards the up and coming youth conservationists in this continent, in Africa?
Oh, thanks. That's a great one. Yeah, I think truly inspiring and nurturing that love of learning and passion for conservation is really key. And then just making spaces for the youth and listening and supporting and helping. You could call it mentoring. I've been assigned a few mentors over the years, but the colleagues and friends that I informally acquired as mentors have been the most helpful. There are lots of them. And these relationships grew from spending time together in person, some of them from working closely online. And I just think that making space for those interactions and those connections is really important. Imposter syndrome is real. And as I start a new degree in a new place, in a new academic system that's very different to anything I've experienced before, it's really creeping in. It's incredibly intimidating and overwhelming. Where at home I have a different role. I've helped so many young students and young scientists with writing and helping them find funding and different scholarships and helping them navigate that space. Yeah, and just connecting people to other people who can help them, less experienced scientists to people who are in the field they want to be in. And yeah, now I'm on the other end of that, and I'm really humble and grateful for the opportunity, and how people are now helping me. And yeah, I just like to encourage everybody to make space to foster the growth of young people where they can.
And I think that's great. It's, I mean, you're a testament of being connected. It really is about connecting various people, right, and giving them those platforms. Okay, so those are the only 3 questions that we had prior. So thank you again, Garabo, Reynolds, and Rio, just for your valuable contribution in this discussion. Really, really, really appreciate it. And what I would love to do is open up now to the floor. Like I said, we do have a couple of questions in the chat box. I don't think we'll probably have enough time for all of them, but I'll table 1 or 2. Reynolds, there's a question in the chat, and it is, you mentioned our obsession for growth. What does Africa's future look like if not rooted in growth? So I guess what they're trying to say here, is it a question of redefining what is growth for this continent, or is it completely foregoing the growth-focused narrative?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's about redefining growth, because of course it's very evident that we face very intricate and complex challenges because of this old traditional metrics like GDP, which really fail to incorporate social progress, happiness indices, environmental impact, and human development. And I think we are really forced and at a T-junction where we really need to start looking at alternative paradigms of measuring progress, looking at an African perspective. And very often I say, well, young people are coming out of school and they are being taught to pronounce nouns such as industrialization, commercialization. And these are all nouns that are very unfriendly to a finite planet where we are running out of resources. So unless we really redefine what we mean by growth, then we will keep on supporting systems of extraction and destruction. Yeah. And in my view, I think in terms of measuring progress, we need to look at how we circulate value, because at the time when we're at the precipice of civilizational collapse, it will make sense to rethink value creation and how we circulate that as communities that are working together, sharing resources sustainably, and not a society where the 1% own much more health, much more wealth than the rest of the bottom majority.
Yeah, and I love what you said there about, it's re-evaluating what constitutes as value and how do then we circulate that value. So thank you so much, Reynold. We have another question for Karabo in the chat. So Karabo, your question is regarding sewage pollution levels in oceans. Can you recommend an appropriate public platform for civic group on the lower south coast of KZN to share results of independent water quality monitoring? That's quite a mouthful, but I hope you got the gist of that, Karabo. Is Karabo still there? Okay, I think let's circle back maybe to Rio while Karabo reconnects again. We have another question, and it reads, what do you think the youth's role is in curbing the poaching endangered species, often when many of these wildlife products have often been used for thousands of years?
Wow, that's a really challenging one, but I think we have an amazing opportunity working with the youth to make changes in this field. And I saw that in Hoedspruit, there were a lot of groups working with school children, doing basic environmental education, and they can go home and educate their parents. One of the really interesting ones for me, especially related to rhino poaching, at first I really didn't understand it, but there were a few conservation NGOs going into rural communities and offering help with looking after dogs, doing vaccinations, providing food at super discounted rates, and teaching kids to care for their pets. And at first it didn't make sense, but then they explained that this was the idea of sort of trying to foster empathy for animals. If you can have a compassion for the dogs in your community, maybe that can extend out further as you grow up. Yeah, off the top of my head, that's what comes to mind with
wonderful. Thanks again, Rio. And like we said, I think we'll circle the questions back to you and send them back to our audiences. But thank you so much for that input. I see that Karabo is back on. Karabo, are you able to speak?
Yes, I am. I don't know if my video will work though. I apologize for the connectivity issues.
No problem. So would you like me to just quickly read the question again? It was quite a mouthful, but quite very specific to your field. And the question is, regarding sewage pollution levels in oceans, can you recommend an appropriate public platform for a civic group on the lower south coast of KZN to share results of independent water quality monitoring?
That is quite a difficult question. I don't know a specific group to do that, but I do know that the South Africa Youth Parliament for Water does have people that they're working with down in KZN. So you can contact me if you're looking for a specific group, and I will connect you to the right people because the parliament is based in KZN. I also know with World Merit South Africa, they're doing a lot of ocean cleanups, so they might know a public company to discuss with. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Karabo. We will, your social media and platforms are available. We have another question, which I'll actually pose to both Reynold and Rio. And the question is, so let's start with Rio. Science communication is very important. How do you go about making spaces or giving a platform for the youth in your journalistic space when there's bigger, older voices that are out there in the media who want to listen? Who they would want to rather listen to?
Yeah, I think what Roving Reporters is doing in this space is really, really great because they're taking young scientists and they're giving them the opportunity to showcase their first-hand experiences in the field. And I really feel like having this strong first-hand feature, real life, this is what happened to me introduction is a great way of capturing an audience, and not necessarily an audience who was planning to read about the science that you're about to teach them about. Sort of just by having this really immersive, captivating intro, I think you have the potential to engage a way wider audience. So I think that's a really, that's how one way that we're making spaces.
Yeah, and then 100% agreed. And I think maybe Reynolds, yeah, like I said, you're a gamer and a writer, a poet. Perhaps you can share in terms of just, again, science communication is something that is important. How do you go about in your personal space and capacity to share some of the work when obviously young people might rather listen to older voices? And yeah, so in that innovative space, how do you go about science communication?
Yeah. So in terms of science communication, what we do is, of course, we try and bring both young people and the old generation together in one space. Whether it's policymakers, young professionals, or students, we co-design games where we take the professionals out of their normal positions, biases, and give them new positions. So for instance, you make the politician a young person at school, and then you give the power to the young person. And then you put them in this transformative space where they undergo certain game conditions and rules. And it's often very complicated and very complex, but in the end, they have to collaborate and they have to become creative. And after that game, during reflection, you get the older generation to really think differently about the world and to think differently about what young people say. And of course, the young ones always love having power beyond the politicians. But I think the power of that is really the reflections after the game, where you get a space where both of them get to reflect and in the end, really tend to think differently. And I think that's the power of the game because it gives you a new perspective of the world, where the younger generation are able to walk not only in the game, but beyond the game with the policymakers in their communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Reynolds. And I see that we had an earlier question from Suzanne Feta for you, Karabo. And when you raised the point about, the seats at the table and having the tools at the table, the question is, what do you think would be some important steps towards greater representation by youth in the important decision-making fora?
Thank you for that question. The first step would be recognizing youth as young professionals and not just as youth. And then secondly, having a seat at the table means that in every process of the decision making, you have one or two youth representatives who are specialists in that field. Having us there brings a different narrative, brings a different perspective, as we are the people on the ground, we are the people that understand what the changes can be in the future. But also just having platforms like these where you're giving youth a chance to voice what they're doing, what they think can be done, not just because of, it's Youth Month or anything like that, but just having them in all of these all the time. Just having youth there, not as an exception, but as part of the process. Yes.
Yeah, and I really, really love that. I think, Rio, maybe you can jump in and add there. The follow-up question to that is, what would your message to us, the older generation, be in terms of how we facilitate this?
Yeah, I think Karabo made great points. I really believe in making space for genuine connection. At least that's what's really helped me, whether it was through university camps or working one-on-one with people online. I have many mentors I haven't actually met in real life, but they've been incredibly powerful in empowering me and teaching me and being there as a sounding board when the going gets tough. So yeah, just creating those spaces is, and NGOs can create spaces for youth to get involved, and I think we have some phenomenal initiatives in South Africa where we have government-sponsored internships, and I think those are really, really great ways for youth to get their foot in the door and have an opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. I see that Suzanne had actually pointed out in the chat, just saying great point to both yourselves and Karabo, just regarding recognizing that youth, not just as a constituency, but for their professional contribution. And it's important to recognize young scientists and practitioners as a sort of cutting edge knowledge in the African continent, and inviting their ideas in these spaces and platforms. So I think at this point, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but perhaps what I can do before I wrap up is to each of you individually, as a closing remark. Reynold, we can start with you. Just closing remarks as a young person, as an environmentalist in the African continent. What might be some of your closing remarks and advice that you might give the audience to the continent in terms of change and impact for our continent?
Yeah, I think for me, in my last remarks, I'll say that as much as our future looks very uncertain, I think if we all take incremental steps, small incremental steps with every bit of hope, love, and compassion in our hearts, then we are able to transform our communities. Because in the end, our future depends on our collective efforts. And as humanity, we are called to come together and to weave together that fabric of humanity in ways that are full of compassion and a lot of love.
Thank you, agreed. And then I saw Rio do a thumbs up there, that incremental change, like slowly moving, it's still progress, and to have the patience and resilience for that. So 100% agree, incremental change will lead to big change in the end. Rio, perhaps some of your closing remarks?
Yeah, I think Reynolds, you did it so eloquently. But yeah, that incremental change is so important to me, and celebrating it, keeping that momentum up. Small changes cumulatively have a huge impact, and making space for the youth, and then facilitating and nurturing the youth's understanding of the environment, especially in this era of gross misinformation, where scientific facts can so easily be distorted or overlooked. It's so important to educate and, facilitate understanding and the curiosity in the youth. So, yeah, I think we have...
I love that, the curiosity for the youth. I think it's one of the things that, you can never outgrow curiosity. I think innovation is birthed from curiosity, and a mind to continuously looking for growth and continuously looking to innovate and continuously being curious about the world and where it's going. So thanks, Rio. Karabo, perhaps some final remarks from you?
I think they've both said it well. It's about including the young people, but also transparency with the young people and just leading them in the right direction. There's a need for, we like to say, I don't need to hold your hand all the way, but in this instance, some young people really need that mentoring from a young age. We need this in schools. This should be starting in schools, where we're being taught about environmental sustainability and entrepreneurship all the way from primary school. It's just something that we need to do. We should facilitate that movement and that education. But yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So yeah, again, I think we are now coming to the close of our session. We do have a few minutes to spare, so perhaps we'll give you the gift of time. I don't see any more questions, but I do invite everyone to share their questions, and we'll get the panelists to revert to you, whether it's individually. But yeah, please do share your questions with us. You can find them on the social media platforms. And I believe it's time for me to now wrap up. So firstly, I do want to just express my sincere gratitude to Rio, Reynolds, and Karabo for your valuable input and just significant contribution to conservation, yes, in this continent, but to the world at large. I'm very excited to see where your journeys go and just to follow those journeys and perhaps even be a part of those. Yeah, so to the audience, thank you so much for joining us. Our next Tipping Point webinar is scheduled for the 27th of July. And in this webinar, we'll focus on the discussion around wildlife economies and lab-grown meat and how these create possibilities for rewilding landscapes. So we'll have Dr. Frank, who's the director at the African Wildlife Institute, and he'll be facilitating this topic of discussion. So you do not want to miss this one. And you can register for the webinar by clicking in the link provided in our chat box. And also, do remember to sign up for the OGRC quarterly newsletter so you can stay updated with all the events and all the upcoming things that are coming up. You can find the link in our chat box as well. And while I'm there too, I think I would like to express my gratitude and thanks to Dr. Duncan McFadden and Radani Neguda, who head up the research and conservation portfolio within Oppenheimer Generations. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for continuously creating spaces and platforms in the conservation space across our continent. I'm excited to see more of the work that will roll out in the years to come, and very proud of the work that you've already currently done. So for those who might have missed the webinar, worry you not, we will have this session recorded and uploaded in the OGRC YouTube channel. The link will also be found in our chat box, or you can also find it on their website. So once again, thank you everyone for participating, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next Tipping Points webinar in July. Goodbye and have a great day.